Hi everyone. It's wonderful to see so many of you, considering that it's like way too early in the morning. Hi, I'm Sara, and I study English. I study English language at the University of Turku, and I study alchemical texts, which is why I will tell you about alchemy on a more general level, also with some authentic examples. So super briefly about me and how I approach alchemy, just so you know that I do not know everything about the history of alchemy. I'm doing a PhD at the University of Turku, and I'm working on the manuscript copies of a work called The Mirror of Alchemy. These copies are from the 15th to the 17th century, so there's a nice 200-year period there. And my focus is textual and linguistic, and I emphasize the manuscripts as physical objects as well. But I also deal with the history of science, obviously, because I am working on alchemical texts. And one of my goals is to produce an open access digital edition of this alchemical material that I'm working with. So when that's available, it will be freely available for everyone to use, whether for role-playing or research purposes. And I don't know what your conceptions are about alchemy, but I will be kind of firmly concentrating on the scientific side of alchemy today, because that's what my material is like. So not so much weird magic, more actual early science. But let's move on to a very brief history of alchemy. So, as we probably all know, alchemy has been later considered a pseudoscience, kind of more weird, magical, blah, just not very scientific. However, in the Middle Ages and early modern period, European alchemy was actually one of the first experimental sciences, so they were actually performing experiments according to somewhat scientific principles and sort of laying the foundations for what would later become chemistry, for instance. Transmutation, so the transformation of things into other things, super scientific way of putting it, by the way, that's basically one of the main concepts of alchemy, as you probably all know. Transforming lead into gold, that was one of the main objects of especially Western alchemy. And what I was going to say was that alchemy was kind of considered a pseudoscience also because of the influence of 19th century occultism. So we basically, our conception of history has been influenced by the sort of 19th century weird stuff that was going on. So basically in the historiography of alchemy, we can divide it into these 4 time periods. So Greco-Egyptian, kind of the earliest time period. Also the birth of metallurgy, stuff like that. People were discovering a lot of the fundamental concepts of alchemy at this time. And then the Arabic/Muslim period, which was when Arabic alchemy basically kind of, like with a lot of sciences, they took the Greeks' knowledge and they developed it further, and they kind of preserved the ancient knowledge and brought it forwards into their time. And they developed a lot of the sort of core theories of alchemy that would persist for hundreds of years afterwards. And the period that I'm going to concentrate on in this presentation is the Latin European phase, like from the medieval to the sort of early modern period. And yes, modern alchemy is apparently a thing. There is a site called alchemyforum.com or something, and while people do a lot of the kind of more esoteric, improve your own spiritual self kind of alchemy, they also just apparently try to transform things into gold, which I think is cute, but, because apparently we might be close to transforming some things into gold, like, with science, like a particle of something into gold, maybe. But I don't think you can do it in your own little pot at home, but I'm sorry, I'm dissing these people who have a great hobby. Anyway, that's a fun place to look for if you want some present-day alchemy stuff. Yeah, so I will be concentrating on the European side of things because that's what I'm most familiar with my material. Alchemy's also been practiced in other parts of the world, especially in China and India, but those alchemical traditions are rather different, so I won't be looking into them. There's been stuff written about them you can find out. Yeah, so exoteric versus esoteric alchemy is kind of what I was talking about with the weird occult thing, because esoteric alchemy is basically, improving your inner self, like becoming a better person through the alchemy of the self. But what I will concentrate on is the kind of very down-to-earth exoteric alchemy. It's all about substances, actual things that you can touch. Even though it gets a bit philosophical, it's basically kind of down-to-earth as you can get, really. All right. So, to my main focus. So, medieval European alchemy, unsurprisingly, was the result of a lot of different developments. It was basically a melting pot of everything that had come before, which can be seen even just in the etymology of the word, because alchemy, as many other al words in English, comes from Arabic, so alchemia. We kind of don't exactly know what chemia comes from, but there's a lot of etymological debate about that, but I won't go into that because this is not a linguistics presentation. I'm sorry, Gabaya. But yeah, so medieval European alchemy was really into this guy. Well, alchemists were really into this guy called Hermes Trismegistus, who you may or may not have heard of. He was sort of this mythical founder of alchemy. He's kind of based on the Egyptian god Tot, but also on Hermes in Greek mythology, and then he was kind of maybe an actual guy, probably not, but he's referred to in a lot of texts as the founder of alchemy. He's like the uber alchemist. But yeah, interestingly, the golden age of European alchemy was not even in the medieval period, so it was more in the early modern period from around 1500 to 1650. So there were a lot of developments in the core goals of alchemy. A lot of stuff was going on. People were inventing new theories and discovering things about the nature of matter, basically. And also medicines were a thing. I'll talk a bit about alchemy and medicine in a while. But yeah, alchemical texts had been transmitted in manuscript, obviously, a long time before print. We have a lot of alchemical manuscript texts in many languages, Arabic, lots in Latin, also lots in vernacular languages such as English and French and stuff. I have looked at quite a few English alchemical manuscripts, and that's just like a tiny droplet in the ocean of alchemical texts. But the thing with the printed book was that obviously you could reach far more people, and thus the alchemical texts that were in print enabled alchemical concepts to kind of travel much more broadly. There aren't as many printed alchemical books, especially from the earlier period, and that's probably partly because alchemists kind of maybe wanted to keep their secrets secret, so you would just copy down something from your friend's book, your friend's manuscript book, into your own manuscript book, and thus transmit information kind of in a much more in a much less sort of public sense. So that was kind of a thing. Yeah, so the limited kind of circulation of these texts was intentional, and also there's a lot of stuff like you're just scribbling one recipe from your friend. You don't want to have this whole book. But yeah, and also there are alchemical experiments written down from very early periods, which is cool. Right, so let's go to the sort of why the heck did people believe this works? Well, alchemy is entirely logical if you subscribe to the worldview that these people did. So you've probably all heard of the classical elemental theory. So there's the 4 Aristotelian elements of water, earth, fire, and air. Those have kind of had these complementary features, and that was kind of what everything is made of. And basically this was the sort of very basis for the alchemical material worldview. However, later on, especially in Muslim alchemy, they started to develop this idea of there being two sort of philosophical elements called sulfur and mercury, which everything was formed of. So, like, all matter was some combination of these, and especially all minerals, such as gold. So it's a bit confusing with these philosophical elements, because they are not exactly the same as what we think mercury and sulfur are, but it's not quite clear what exactly they are, and I don't know if the alchemists themselves knew, or if it's just that I don't know. Maybe one of you knows what they meant. But in any case, these were kind of, I don't know if they were maybe more just this sort of abstract principles by which you could do your experiments. So sulfur is solid, mercury is liquid, as we know. Sulfur is dry, mercury is wet. Sulfur is active, and mercury is passive, because they had to have these binary things going on. That was a big thing in alchemy, the whole sort of binary items combining to become something new. But yeah, basically the worldview is that if everything is formed of these items in different proportions, you can change the proportions and then get something different. I think that's quite logical. Like, okay, if lead is formed of, sulfur and mercury in some proportion, then you change the proportions and woohoo, gold. I think it's quite logical. So yeah, you can just, basically they wanted to change things from the sort of rubbish stuff like lead into cool stuff like gold, because gold, I guess. But basically transformations of all sorts are an essential part of the alchemical worldview. And a word just that I wanted you all to know, because I think it's beautiful and awesome, chrysopoeia, which is from Greek and basically just means the process of making gold. This also turns up quite a bit, and it's just such a nice word. Yep, so I will explain a bit more about some of the core concepts. So the Mercury Sulfur theory that I mentioned earlier, so it kind of coexisted with the system of the four elements, and as you can probably guess, in some ways it was derivative, so there's the opposites thing. They all had complementary properties. And kind of, there's been this theory, well, obviously, sulfur can ignite, so that's like fire, and then mercury's kind of liquid, so that's like water, stuff like that. And this theory originated in Muslim alchemy. So there was this guy called Geber who came up with this theory, and it persisted for many, many centuries, so this was a very persistent theory and awesome. So people basically thought that sulfur and mercury combined in the earth, and then they formed minerals, like metals, basically. This was like the basic thing. And they thought that you could basically try to replicate that process in your own little furnace in your laboratory. So that's the kind of basis there. Yeah, I already said that the kind of philosophical sulfur and mercury, not quite the same, but not quite sure how. It's a bit of a mystery to me. There was also a version where mercury alone forms all the metals. There's basically a lot of different theories that say a lot of contradictory things, but this was one of the main theories throughout the medieval and early modern period. Then, 7 metals, important, possibly known to you. So even though alchemy isn't as connected to astrology as you might think, like I haven't come across too many things where it would be important to perform this stage of the process under a certain phase of the moon or something. But the 7 planets were all connected to different metals. So at this time, the worldview was that there were 7 planets. Like, this is just how many there are in the sky. The sun and the moon were included amongst these. And they were linked to different metals, as you can see here. And they also had different signs. So basically, the astrological signs are what is often used in alchemical texts as well. And we know gold and silver, they're the noble ones, they're what people wanted to go towards, and you just want to get the lesser metals into a more awesome form because gold and silver. Oh yeah, and because things were considered to be combinations of sulfur and mercury, metals were compounds, but now of course we know they are actual elements. But back in the day, they were compounds. And now for a concept that everyone knows, at least from Harry Potter, the Philosopher's Stone, which was botched in the American version. It's not the Sorcerer's Stone. That's not what it is. This is one of my personal pet peeves. So anyway, the Philosopher's Stone, one of the ultimate, if not the ultimate goal of alchemy. So basically the stone was what would enable you to transform things into more awesome things. So yeah, because gold was considered to be incorruptible, as we kind of know. It's kind of hard for gold to decay or anything. So basically you want to make gold with the Philosopher's Stone. And this concept turns up, it's not in every alchemical text, but it's definitely, there are so many recipes on how to make the stone, and in various languages. It's a real thing. And it's a very complex process, and early modern alchemists had some kind of like process, but then before that it was just kind of, there were millions of recipes for how to do this. But basically first you would try to achieve the white stone, which was like stage one. You can make silver with that, and then you can refine that further into the red stone, which makes gold. So there were kind of stages in this thing. And the elixir of life, possibly also familiar to you, could be produced with the help of the Philosopher's Stone. And J.K. Rowling actually kind of did her work with this stuff, because, like, for instance, the character of Nicholas Flamel, he's an actual historical alchemist. So she did some stuff right. But yeah, so the elixir of life was kind of produced with the Philosopher's Stone, but sometimes these terms are used interchangeably, so it can be quite hard to know if an alchemist in a text is talking about some kind of elixir or about the stone, because the terms are kind of, they might just mean the same thing. The stone was probably something that was kind of more solid, powdery, something that you can spread on things, and I guess the elixir was liquid because it's an elixir, but terminology is sometimes a bit of a challenge. But yeah, oh yeah, about the elixir of life. The common concept, I think, is that it was used to achieve immortality. But that wasn't really a thing in European alchemy, because it was considered unchristian to want to be actually immortal, living forever. However, even in the Bible, there are examples of people living like super long past the usual human lifespan. Like, hang on, there's like Methuselah lived 969 years, apparently. So that was kind of the goal of the elixir of life. So you could kind of prolong your life, but you would eventually die and then, you know, experience the Christian afterlife, because that was a thing. In Chinese alchemy, apparently, the elixir was used for actual immortality, because there's more of the sort of immortal stuff going on in the Chinese worldview, but I don't know as much about that. But yeah, how do we make this Philosopher's Stone? This is the sort of process that appears in the alchemical texts that I work with, so I haven't tried it out yet, but please tell me when you do. So basically you need to choose the right material to make it from, and there was a lot of debate about this. Like, most people concluded that you needed some kind of mineral or metal, something to start out with, maybe a bit of pinch of gold in there just to get it right. But people had also used stuff like hair and blood and urine and dung, and they experimented a lot. Anyway, you when you've got the right material, you place it in a sealed vessel, you put it in a furnace, you heat it for a very long time, and you do some other stuff to it, but that's kind of slightly more like variable. But basically the stone has various stages of development. So first there is the black stage, called nigredo in Latin. Then, if you're lucky, the stone will start to develop many colors. So cauda pavonis, the peacock's tail, so there's like all sorts of colors going on. And then you get to albedo, which is when the stone starts to get white, and that's a great sign, because after that you might get the yellow, citrinitas, which then is a sign that you're on your way to the red stone, so the rubedo, which is like, as I've mentioned, the main thing. And then, when you've got your red stone, or your white stone if you only got that far, that's fine, then you basically, there's the stage of projection, which is like, you cast the stone over whatever material you want to transform, and then you get nice gold or whatever you want from it. And multiplication is basically just that you can use the stone to endlessly multiply things into gold. So this is how it goes in most alchemical texts. This is, it's fine. This is how you get stuff. Yeah, that's the process. However, let's move on to a slightly more, like, does this make sense? This seems probably quite ridiculous to us. But then again, I mean, I don't know much about chemistry, but there's processes there. Things happen, and, I don't really know much about science, even though I'm working on historical science. There we go. But yeah, as I said at the start, these days, the popular conception of alchemy is definitely more kind of magical than sciencey. But in the material that I've looked at in manuscript in English, it seems that most alchemical texts are actually copied more with medical and other alchemical texts than actually magic. And so science seems to be more of the thing in the Middle Ages. However, alchemical fraud was a definite problem in the Middle Ages and early modern period. So there was even Chaucer, the famous English poet, in his Canterbury Tales has one tale, which is basically, it's really boring and it just describes a few alchemical fraud experiments. This fraud who's just basically mixing gold into things and kind of pretending to be an awesome alchemist. So I think Chaucer had some kind of problem with, maybe he was cheated by an alchemist or something, because that story is really boring and it's not funny at all, and he just has a bone to pick with whatever alchemist he had a problem with. Anyway, you can read that if you want a sort of easy to approach medieval alchemical fraud story. But yeah, so that was one reason why people kind of started disbelieving in alchemy, because there were a lot of people who obviously just wanted to make money off alchemy and go yeah, I can make gold, no problem, and then do a bit of fraud and then run off once you've got some of your reward and, great career plan. But there were really people who were actually just trying to do science and find out cool stuff about the world. So I kind of like to call early alchemy kind of scientific esotericism. So there definitely was this tradition of secretive language use. So you kind of don't want to reveal all your secrets. And it's sort of on the borders of science and something else. But then again, a lot of medieval sciences are. Astrology was a science in the Middle Ages, so there we go. And yeah, it depends on the individual text, basically. Some things are more practical, which is basically what I've looked at mostly, and some things are more weird. But yeah, for a presentation a year ago, I coined this term, hashtag not all alchemists, because not all alchemists were frauds. Some of them were genuinely trying their best and actually trying to be scientific. So yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about alchemy's relationship to the various sciences that have kind of influenced it, or that it has influenced. Obviously, chemistry, we can even see it in the words, alchemy, chemistry. But interestingly, alchemy, like I said at the start, was kind of at its peak at the time when we would consider to be the time of the scientific revolution, which I think is cool. It's all a continuum. There's not suddenly people decided that alchemy is rubbish and not science, and hey, this thing called chemistry is what we're doing. Oh my god, I haven't explained better there. I should explain that better. Yeah, I would call it the predecessor of chemistry. I'm kind of arguing with myself here. But there's a continuum between alchemy and chemistry. But basically, you can't say that chemistry only developed from alchemy, because it's all part of people just trying to do science and trying to be better at understanding the world through different ways. Some of them I'm sure that some chemists went through alchemy, and later on I'll give you an example of a rather surprising alchemist from this period. But basically, they were all trying. And alchemy and chemistry are kind of just all it's all part of a continuum, and it's really hard to kind of separate them from each other in this period. And for instance, a lot of chemical processes and tools were invented through alchemy. So our favorite distillation, we would literally probably, like, alchemy is why we have alcohol, which, also from Arabic as a word. Because they invented distillation. You could distill, make things more perfect, so like kind of make alcohol more perfect by making it stronger, basically. This is a thing that was invented, thank you, alchemy. Obviously, the refinement of metals, which is important in chemistry, they were doing it in alchemy. And they invented a lot of the chemical vessels, like here in the pictures you've got, on the top there's the sort of earlier alchemical vessels, and then at the bottom this very chemical looking thing, which is basically all the same, because they'd invented some useful things, so why not? Why not use them? Interestingly, if you're interested in language, in early modern English, alchemy and chemistry is not really a distinction that people made, even in the language, so people would use alchemy or chemistry, and it's all basically part of the same series of things, so they were pretty much synonymous. But so, alchemy and medicine. So alchemy was used for healing to some extent in the Middle Ages, but the early modern period was when people really started to get into all sorts of distilling medicines and preserving stuff in alcohol and all sorts of stuff that was related to alchemy. And as I mentioned, the elixir was kind of a medicine. Also comes through Arabic with the lovely particle there. A lot of things. Aha, I have another, what does this mean? I actually don't know. If someone knows what xerion means, please tell me. So yeah, the elixir basically removed impurities from the human body, and thus it eliminated the things that cause sickness, and thus you live longer. Not forever, but longer. And one guy who was really into alchemical medicine was Paracelsus. Actually also appears in Harry Potter as a chocolate frog card person. He was really into alchemy, but he kind of had his own thing going on, and he was trying to revolutionize medicine with the help of alchemy. So he was apparently a really weird guy, whose real name I cannot remember. It was something with bombastus. It was like this. You could see why he chose Paracelsus as his name. Sorry, Theophilus Bombastus von Hohenheim. Yes, there we go. Thank you. Yes, so you can see why. Yeah, this is why he chose Paracelsus. Anyway, you can look him up. He was a weird guy with a very weird philosophy. Anyway, Alchemy and Magic. I won't talk much about this because it's really not something that I have focused on in my research. Alchemy is connected to the sort of Hermetic traditions, Hermes Trismegistus, like I talked about. It's in the same tradition, but then it's not explicitly magical as such. And alchemists definitely considered the alchemical processes to be natural, and not weirdly magical. Although also, in the Middle Ages, natural magic was a thing, so there were some types of magic that were considered to be more natural than others. But alchemy and magic aren't connected in the literature as much as you might think. But yeah, basically, people observed things in nature, such as adding rennet to milk. Cheese! Something more precious than milk, in my opinion. So why not transmute lead to gold? This is just fine. However, some alchemists also had weird magical interests, such as John Dee, of whom you may have heard. He was really into prophecies and talking to angels and also alchemy. So, there's people who were into that. And like I said at the start, 19th century alchemy was really way more into the occult and magical practices and connected to all sorts of weird stuff that people were doing at the time. I will very briefly talk about alchemical language use. So, alchemical texts are definitely considered quite difficult. But that basically is partly just because they haven't been studied that much. So, it's not all as hard as you might think. They use a lot of metaphors, or they can use a lot of metaphors, but that's basically just, there's a lot of dictionaries and things, so you can just kind of go and try and search for if this is a common metaphor, like the chemical wedding, which is basically the union of Mercury and Sulfur to become the Philosopher's Stone. Husband and wife, that's like sulfur and mercury, because obviously the husband is the sort of dry, rational, etc. part, and the wife is the, mercury, mercurial, stuff like that. There's a lot of weird binarist stuff in these. And the castle, which is like the vessel that you perform the operation in. But these are fairly all right. Alchemy also uses a lot of symbols, such as, for instance, the early modern ones in this table that is very tiny in the picture. So this is partly maybe to conceal information, but I also think partly it's just like professional language use. Like academic articles these days, there's all the IE, etc. My CF right there. So it's kind of the same. If you know, you know, and then it's just a quicker way to write things down, basically. But yeah, there was a lot of symbol use, especially in the later part of this period. So I think some alchemical texts are really quite easy if you know the terminology and metaphors. For instance, recipes. Like, you might not always know, it might not make sense, like, as such, but you kind of know what's going on if you've studied these things. And yeah, medicine was also used as a synonym for the Philosopher's Stone or elixir. It doesn't really imply a medicinal use. It's just, another... There were a lot of metaphors and things could mean other things. And there also are a lot of intentionally confusing texts, because people might not always want others to know what their experiments meant. But this, I want to stress, it really isn't quite as common as you might think. And for instance, the text that I'm working on, which I will show you right now, is not quite as weird as you might think. It's maybe just because I've been studying it for 4 years, but haha, it's fine. It's really not as weird as you might think. So the Mirror of Alchemy is based on the Latin text Speculum Alchemiae, which used to be attributed to the scholar Roger Bacon, but he didn't really write it. It was just some random dude, presumably, who just wanted to put a cool person's name on his text, because that's how things worked back then. So yeah, this was also printed in 1597, which is actually interesting because there weren't that many alchemical works yet in print at that point. But there's manuscript copies already from the 15th century onwards, and this is what I'm studying. And the Mirror of Alchemy is basically what I call Alchemy 101, so it's just an introduction to alchemy in 7 chapters, and it kind of goes from theoretical to more practical. So firstly, and it's actually divided into chapters, which is very nice, in most copies at least. So the first chapter, what is alchemy? It just kind of gives a short definition of alchemy and says that it was invented by Hermes, incidentally. The second chapter is about the formation of metals, so how metals kind of develop in the earth, and there's a description of the various properties of the 7 metals. Although actually only 6, because I think the writer kind of failed there. But anyway. The third chapter is about what substance you should make your elixir from, or the Philosopher's Stone. So this is kind of getting into slightly more practical. The fourth chapter is very practical. It tells you how you should proceed with making the stone, basically. It gives you a little overview there. The fifth chapter tells you what kind of vessel you should have. So it kind of said that it should be like pottery, except kind of like maybe kind of like glass, and it's very kind of specific about that. And it tells you what kind of furnace you need to shove your vessel in. And then the sixth chapter is nice and specific. It has the colors appearing in the work, which are basically the just the processes that I described in the earlier slide. So we go from black to actually go to green, which is a phase that sometimes appears. Then we go to the peacock, all of the colors, and then white, yellow, red. And the seventh chapter then is about using the elixir, so how you can get 1,000 items of gold with this thing, and very nice. So there's a picture of one of the manuscript copies there, and that's one of the prettiest ones. Most of them are not very pretty because this was more kind of practical stuff. And yeah, there's just a very brief text there, which I will just read to you in modern English, in case you don't read Middle English. I don't know why you wouldn't, but there we go. So, this is from the first chapter. What is alchemy? It behoveth you to consider the words of Hermes the philosopher, saying on this wise, Alchemy is a bodily substance, made of one and by one, perfectly joining together precious things by cunning and working, and turneth them by natural commiction into a better kind. Another definition is that alchemy is a science that teacheth to transform all manner of bodies into each other by their proper medicine, as it showeth openly in the philosophers' books. So, this is basically claiming that it will tell you exactly how to do this thing. It's not quite as clear as that, but it's still not too bad. So yeah, I am kind of running out of time and I want there to be time for questions. So I would just briefly give you one almost final thing about the sort of moving totally away from my material, which I wish I could talk to you more about, but alas, this is not an academic conference. So what was alchemy? What was the sort of social meaning of alchemy? So especially in the context of lords and princes and other rulers, they had a very conflicted relationship with alchemy, because as you can see, like, the production of gold, if someone managed to actually make crap loads of gold, that would be a problem, because it would totally wreck the economy. Like, that's just, too much gold and your whole, like, you'll be richer than the king, and that's a definite problem for the king. But on the other hand, if the king can get some gold, that's cool. So, I guess it was kind of a, if you have your own little alchemist, then yay. But if it's some random alchemist making gold, nope. So in medieval England, there was actually a law forbidding alchemy, especially the sort of alchemy that made gold. So this law was within 1403, so that was when they were clearly having a lot of problems with alchemists. And alchemists could get a license from the king, though, and they did, a lot of them. There's like documents of alchemists who've received a license to perform alchemy from the king. So it was fine if you were like licensed. And there were there's just a couple of examples of monarchs who were really into alchemy and had their own alchemists. James IV of Scotland, sort of like late medieval, early modern guy. He was interested in other kinds of science as well, but he had an alchemical lab in one of his castles and used up a load of money. Like, he was just pouring money into this thing, which I'm sure pleased the alchemists a lot. And this was led by this guy called John Damian. They did a lot of distillation of things and tried to make quintessence, which is another maybe word for the elixir. And also, John Damian was this guy who performed other experiments as well. Like, one time he tried to make wings, and he kind of he jumped off of Stirling Castle with his wings, and as you might imagine, he was no Leonardo da Vinci. He just fell down and broke his leg, and that's kind of hilarious. So this is the kind of person who was the king's alchemist. And then another king, emperor in fact, Rudolf II, who was in Prague. Prague was a huge center of alchemy, which I have no time to get into, but this guy was really into alchemy, and he invited a lot of European alchemists to his court, including John Dee, for instance, and he had an alchemical laboratory that was actually, one of them was actually connected to his castle through a secret passage under the river. There's this great museum in Prague, which is basically an old alchemical laboratory that was discovered not that many years ago. I recommend it, it's cool, I've been there. But yeah, so that's how into alchemy Rudolf II was. And yeah, like I said, especially Central European lords were really into alchemy for some reason. It was maybe trendy at the time, who knows. Yeah, let's leave a bit of time for questions, but finally, did you know that Isaac Newton was totally an alchemist? Well done! Because I really didn't before I started finding out about this. And so yeah, dude who was considered the symbol of the scientific revolution was in fact also an alchemist. There's this great digital edition called the Chemistry of Isaac Newton project, which they've transcribed and digitized all of his alchemical writings. So you can go and look at them. You can see everything he wrote on alchemy. So this is cool, and this was obviously a huge shock to all the people who were like, oh yes, but Newton was a scientist, and it's like, well, he wrote a lot on alchemy, and he really believed you could transmute things into gold. So there we go, neat line between science and esotericism, and the scientific revolution. So yeah, that's kind of what I. If you take anything away from this presentation, the line between early science or weird stuff and the scientific revolution, it's not a clear-cut line. There's a lot of stuff, and people were totally doing sciencey things even before people invented science in the 16th century, 17th century. So there we go. Some further reading stuff, and now let's have questions. I will repeat them because we're recording this thing. Okay, you were first. Go ahead.
So that sounds an awful lot like metallurgy. So what is the relationship between those?
Okay, so the question was, what's the relationship between metallurgy and alchemy? They are very connected. So basically, one of the things that gave birth to alchemy was the very early discovery of metallurgical developments, like way back in the Egyptian period, for instance. Basically, alchemy is kind of it's metallurgy with a theory, I guess, and with a sort of more unified worldview. So you could basically, I'm pretty sure there were people just doing stuff to metals and not thinking about alchemy, but also there was just a lot of alchemy is sort of more refined, and but they're definitely connected. Like, it's sort of, metallurgy is like a part of alchemy, but not all metallurgy is alchemy, if you see what I mean. All right, then we had a question there.
I was wondering if you could talk a little more about the origins of the concept of the Philosopher's Stone. How did they come up with the idea that it exists? How did the concept come into being?
All right, so the question was about how did the concept of the Philosopher's Stone sort of come into being? That is a very good question, and I don't think I'm quite qualified to answer it properly, especially right here. But basically, it was part of this whole, because, okay, in the very early days of alchemy, there was a lot of interest in stuff like there being also like a kind of single material out of which the world is formed, stuff like that. And I think the Philosopher's Stone is kind of connected to that sort of like, just this sort of, there must be one substance that is, that is capable of connecting the world. But I don't really, like, I should go back and read on that, because it's sort of so related to the very early alchemy that I haven't done as much reading on it. But yeah, it's a very interesting question. I will talk to you later about this. Yep.
I heard that there was some concepts and ideas about living matter, or more like how some unliving, in our perspective, some unliving matter have its own life. Is this true that there was that kind of concept in alchemy?
Right, so the question's about living matter, whether people believed that things that we don't consider animate were animate. Yes, this is a thing. For instance, in the formation of metals, people kind of, especially kind of earlier, considered the Earth to be like the womb, basically, and the metals are sort of born in there, like kind of like humans are born, and they were not exactly, like in the later periods, I wouldn't say that people believed they were animate, but definitely in the earlier periods, there was sort of, it was a bit more blurred, like metals or minerals, kind of maybe on the slightly animate, like kind of more like animals, I guess. So there was kind of more of a magical conception there, I think, in the earlier period. But yes, this is a thing in historical alchemy. Yep, go ahead.
Why did they use lead instead of some metal that's more useless?
So why did they use lead instead of a more useless metal? Because, well, basically, at this point, they hadn't discovered too many metals in the first place, and lead was kind of just, it was readily available, and it was used for things, so people kind of had lead around, and it was considered quite useless, in a way. So I think that's why they used it. But basically, people just hadn't discovered too many metals yet, and some of the things that I think they discovered through alchemical experiments were things that we now know to be actual metals and elements, but they thought they were performing, like, actually finding things that were like compounds. But yeah, I think lead was just used because it was one of the 7, basically, and the cheapest of the 7, because there was a total hierarchy there, like, you know, metals listed in order of awesomeness. Lead is the last. It's rubbish. So yeah. Any more questions? Yep, there in the back.
Yeah, you have taken a pretty practical approach to the Philosopher's Stone business. So what's your view on the transportation as allegorical spiritual growth thing?
Right, so what are my views on the Philosopher's Stone transmutation as spiritual growth? Basically, the reason why I've taken a practical approach is because the text that I work on in my PhD is super practical. There's basically, I kind of hope to find something philosophical in there, but nah, it's just about making gold. So that's why I've taken this approach here. But also, like, even though I said that the 19th century was kind of the most active period for the sort of occult, grow your mind kind of alchemy, people were doing that even in the earlier periods. It just was not as major a thing as it was later. But people were basically, like, they wanted to improve their minds as well, especially in the early modern period, like 1500s, 1700s. People were kind of seeking to improve themselves, possibly while also making gold. So just, you know, why not have both? Yeah, I think we have time for one more question and then we're done. But you were first. Yeah.
Have you read the All Souls trilogy by Deborah Harkness?
Oh yes, have I read the All Souls trilogy by Deborah Harkness? I have. I really liked the first bit where she discovers a manuscript and it's described really accurately, and I was like, oh yes, finally someone's describing a manuscript consultation session accurately. But then I didn't really like the vampire romancy thing, but the alchemy stuff was okay. But yes, I have read this thing, but yeah. It was kind of okay with the alchemy, and I definitely liked the manuscript, but I'm still looking for the book that would portray historical alchemy well, or the, you know, role-playing game. So have some materials, here you go. I can send you the slides if anyone's interested. Just come and hit me up afterwards. Anyway, I think we are done. So thank you all very much for coming.